Welcome back. You're watching Luck on Sunday. Now, this week saw the publication of the much-anticipated report from the Horse Welfare Board. It's an independent body that was set up by the three significant power brokers within the sport. So it is not a BHA body as such. It is an independent body, and its 130-page recommendation has been titled, and I think this is significant, A Life Well Lived, which is essentially the thread that runs through a new strategic plan for the welfare of horses bred for racing. Not just the ones that make the racecourse, but all horses that are bred for racing from the cradle to the grave, 2020 to 2024. The independent chair of the Horse Welfare Board is a vastly experienced practitioner, indeed a past president of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. Barry Johnson joins me now. Barry, what a work this is in terms of its depth and volume and size. Why did it need to happen?
I think we needed to pull together all the great works that are being done by the industry, but it was very disjointed, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence that people were being very worried by some of the myths that are put out about racing. And so the industry asked us to look at and pull together a whole strategy for all the various aspects that's already taking place in racing and make it the lifetime. So from birth through to the end of life, all very important stages, not just the bits that are governed by the BHA, which only regulate training and racing. This was to make it an industry-based strategy to secure the welfare of horses.
What do you think were the deficiencies within the sport's attitude to welfare prior to the industry asking you to look at it?
I think one of the deficiencies is that if you ask somebody or question them how they bring up their children, they take a very defensive attitude. And the same's true of racing. You know, when somebody questions you about the way you're looking after the horse and you're living with it 24/7, people take a very defensive view. And I think we've got to get on the front foot and be very positive about the care and attention that these horses get, far more than any other domesticated species. And yet we're not in a position to actually tell the public this and explain and show them what actually happens.
We've heard from 11 times champion trainer Paul Nicholls this morning, very much echoing your sentiments there. We've heard from Rosie Margerson, who's really captured the public imagination with her story of her relationship with her horse. And that's something that you've advocated quite strongly, positive messages of relationships between humans and animals. It's quite a fine line, isn't it, between being on the front foot and putting those messages out there and almost appearing to be defensive, saying, look how well we look after our animals. Do you get my drift?
I think we've got to be honest. In order to get people's trust, we've got to be totally honest. So we have to accept that not everything is perfect, but then we need to put in place measures to make it perfect where we can. And so instant things like the welfare stands at Aintree have turned around that whole discussion where people can talk to the Horse Comes First, World Horse Welfare, RSPCA, and they see what's actually happening, where things can and do go wrong with horses.
There are some specific recommendations in here, which I'll come to later. There's also some more general observations about the state of the sport and attitudes within the sport. What I liked was your attempt to try and define what welfare is, because we talk about it all the time. It regularly appears on our talking points, and you've tried to define it. Where did you get to?
You can't. You can't define welfare because it changes. It's a moving target. If you look at what we considered good welfare 10 years ago or 50 years ago, it's vastly different today. And the one thing we know for certain about welfare is it'll be different again in 10 years' time. So it has to be adaptable to whatever the situation is within the country apart from horses. So that's why instead of defining welfare, we define it by the outcomes as what we could actually achieve with the horses, rather than saying welfare is this and welfare is that, because that just doesn't work. We were amputating horses' tails 50 years ago and things like that. So it will change, and the strategy needs to change as society, who gives us the licence to use horses for racing, as society gives us the licence to use horses for other horse sports and activities. We have to take them with us. So it's social licence.
So just talk me through the four key planks, if you like, of your report.
Well, the first one's obviously the normal welfare, and this is the sort of feeding, nutrition, vaccination, biosecurity, which is an area that we can improve things on, and also the benchmarking of welfare, which we can't do at the moment. And the second one is looking at the lifetime care of the horse. This relies very heavily on one of our enablers, which is data collection statistics, because we don't actually know where a lot of these horses are, and so we need to have 100% identification of where they go to when they leave racing, so that we can actually follow them and see just what does happen to them. At the moment, the trainers and owners do a very good job about rehoming horses, making sure they go to suitable homes. What we don't know is if they get sold on again and become second and third and fourth owners. And so that's part of the lifetime, is being able to make sure there's a system in place to try and help people who take these horses on.
So how do you do that?
What we do is education, so that people who take on a retired thoroughbred know that if something goes wrong, there is somebody they can contact to get help. Hopefully there'll be education so they can learn about how to look after a thoroughbred. And in the ultimate case where things go desperately wrong, then the charity, the ROR, can step in and help these few vulnerable horses that there are and retrain them and get them rehomed. So it's a safety net.
You stress the best possible safety and the understanding and analysis of multiple risk factors. Now, this is presumably to attempt to bring down continuing fatalities in the sport. So you accept that in the report you cannot eliminate fatalities completely.
Yeah, well, safety is one of the factors that we measure welfare with, and it is impossible to keep a horse completely safe. That just does not happen. But what
it's impossible to keep yourself completely safe.
Well, even more so with horses. They seem to have a wish to do something very silly every so often. And so what we've got to try and do is to explain to people that there will be a risk of riding a horse, and there's one of racing a horse. But we should try and lower that risk wherever we possibly can. And that might be by looking at going or starting stalls, or the design or colour of hurdles and fences, talking more to trainers and jockeys about what goes wrong and what we can do to try and prevent it. So we can drive that number of fatalities down, which is something that the government has as a priority. I'm probably more concerned with the number of fallers. If we reduce the number of fallers, we'll reduce the number of fatalities.
And how do you reduce the number of fallers?
By making it so the horse is given every chance to clear the jump and see the jump, and it is being entered in a race that it's possible for it to achieve, and if things aren't going right, it can be pulled up.
And your final point, or your fourth main plank of this, is the growth and maintenance of public trust. To what extent does the public trust horse racing to look after its own house at the moment?
Well, I think at the moment it does, but it does have worries about it, because people are always putting out stories that the industry does not regulate itself. So trust isn't just with the public, it's trust from the industry, for the industry to trust the welfare board, and for the industry to trust its regulator, which is the BHA. And if we get trust within the industry, then we're in a better chance of getting trust from the public, and the public will accept then what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. But it's an enormous exercise of communications, of positive communications, that we have to do to bring the public on side and keep them on side.
What sort of percentage of the public do you think are actively or aggressively offside as far as racing is concerned?
I think offside, probably only 1 or 2%. The huge bulk of the public can go either way, and that's the role of the industry, is to bring those people on side and to trust the industry to do what they expect them to do, which is look after the horses. Now, everybody in the industry is looking after the horses. It's just we fail to communicate that all the time to the public, the great body of public.
You questioned what you described as industry people in your surveys as well. How would you define industry people? I'm only asked because I was quite surprised by the percentage of industry people who felt there were issues in terms of how well horses were looked after.
It's interesting. I think it's the first time anybody's actually asked the industry their view on welfare. People have done lots of reports before. And whereas the public's major concern was fatalities and use of the whip, for the industry the major concern was the retired horses. That's what they saw as a risk. And so I think there's a general feeling everywhere that this is an area where we can make improvements.
And this is people whose livelihoods depend on the sport. Is that how you would define industry people?
Absolutely. It was everybody, whether they worked on courses, trainers, jockeys, veterinary surgeons, anybody involved in the industry could use their views. And so it was interesting to see the concerns that different groups had.
Was there anything while you were conducting this that really surprised you, either pleasantly or negatively?
I think pleasantly that everybody wanted to make things better, if it possibly could be, and everybody wanted the story to be told better. And I think the communications of what happens with racing is a very important side of it.
And what about negatively? There must have been one or two moments where you thought, I hadn't quite anticipated there was a problem of this magnitude or a perception like this, or was it everything as you expected?
No, I think it is as I'd have expected, because obviously the politicians respond to their post bags, and we know what's in their post bags, and we know the campaigns that are put out by various people which do influence people. They may well be myths, but if you say it often enough and loud enough, some people believe it.
You pushed back quite hard against conflating equine welfare or welfare of racehorses with trends towards veganism, for example. You rejected the conflation of that.
I think the public have changed enormously. They view horses as companion animals now, whereas 2 generations back they were seen as pack animals that ploughed fields and had a different view on it altogether. People now see them as companions and should be treated very much in the same way as their pets. So
this is an independent body. You make recommendations to the BHA. What if the BHA don't implement the recommendations?
Well, it's independently chaired. It's not an independent body. There are only 2 independent people on it. The rest are from the industry. So the industry board has recommended this strategy. The board's recommendation went to the industry ruling body, which is the major committee. They've accepted it. So I don't see that the industry is going to reject any of the strategy. But on a personal level, having produced this strategy, that if the industry decided not to use it, then there'd be no point in me staying there.
And have you had positive reaction from stakeholders to this?
Very positive. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised, but the response has been positive from virtually everybody. But then everybody wants the sport to do well. Everybody wants the horse to have a better life. And if this strategy will in some small way give a better life to racehorses, then everybody will get behind it.
What about how you communicate the strategy? There's quite a lot in here about communications. And the one point that confused me slightly was that you talk about robust data being needed in order to formulate strong welfare messaging, because you've got robust data to back it up, and we need to be better at collating the data. But then, the same token, later in the piece you say, we don't want to confuse the public with too much data, we're better off giving them more anecdotal evidence. How do you square those two?
In order to give them anecdotal evidence, you've got to have strong, proper data behind you so that what you're saying is the truth. So if we know that out of all the horses that are retired, the majority have good and fruitful lives playing polo or whatever they do, then that's great. Let's tell everybody there. If the data shows up that there's a weakness, there could be a reputational damage, we need, as an industry, to do something about it and then tell the public what we've done to correct it.
So it's a question of first-level storytelling, but if you're going to do that first-level storytelling, the second-level data has to be there to back it up in case you need it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the point you're trying to make is you can't tell people lies.
Most definitely not. I mean, the trust is based on honesty. And so we know there will be problems with a few retired racehorses. It's inevitable. But if we've put in place a system to try and make sure that doesn't happen, then we can honestly say to people, this is what the industry is doing to try and prevent this happening.
I have to confess, I hadn't anticipated talking extensively about the whip, even though it's the subject that gets most people most excited. Yet there is quite a lot about the whip in your report. There's a whole appendix at the end which runs to 7, 8, 9 pages, and there's a fair few pages at the beginning about it as well. How significant a part of this report do you think use of the whip is?
It's a part. I think other people put greater significance to it than I do in terms of welfare of the horse. But we were asked to look at the whip. Because it's such a difficult and complicated subject, we put in there all our working out. We did a lot of research into the whip because we've recommended that there's a discussion goes on, a consultation period now that'll be run by the BHA. In order to people to make good decisions, they need good information. And so that's why there's a lot of information in this report about the use of the whip. A lot of the science, the history, the politics, the economics, everything is in there. So that when people come with their opinions to the BHA, it's based on facts and it's based on knowledge. And so we commissioned a pretty large piece of work so that we were not just picking things off the wall. That's our working out, and people, the industry, can make its own conclusions.
But you do strongly recommend that either the penalties for use of the whip are increased, or that the whip's use for encouragement is either significantly reduced or got rid of altogether. What's your own personal view on it, Barry?
Well, I don't have personal views. As a chairman of a board, I can tell you what the board's view is, that we should have this consultation process because they feel that the whip is being used too often on big races and it has become a tax.
Yeah.
And people use it and it's bad for the horse and it's bad for racing. And so that's why we recommend that the punishments should be looked at again with a view to increasing them. And that ranges from increasing the number of days penalty to disqualification.
But you've not been installed as independent chair of this because you're Barry Johnson with no experience of anything ever. You've been installed for your years of expertise in looking at animal welfare and in the veterinary science world. So what is your view? Do you think we should carry on using it for encouragement or not?
Well, there isn't a lot of science in this, and that's the problem that everybody has. There isn't a great deal of science being done on the whip. What there is evidence is that the whip does not cause pain, but there's no evidence that it does cause pain. And so we're very short on scientific evidence. But we have a rule, and if we break the rule, then we need to look at, does the punishment lead to behaviour-changing behaviour?
So, in your opinion, should the BHA just do away with it for encouragement purposes and we move forward with the sport? Well,
that's something for the industry to decide. The board wants the consultation process based on the information so that the industry takes responsibility for it. If you try and regulate your way out of welfare problems, people fight against it. If the industry takes something on board, then they'll make it work.
Do you think there's an appetite within the industry to take this on board,
yes.
This particular issue?
Yes.
Because they've passed it to you to say, what do you think? You've passed it back to them and say, well, this is what we think, now you run with it.
I think everybody's fed up of having the arguments about it. And I think because it's enormous reputational damage from it, and jockeys get in trouble if they misuse it, then they get in trouble if they haven't encouraged the horse enough. So I think most people are really just fed up of discussing it every few years.
You talk about the ethical defence of it. That's something you weren't able to formulate in there, but you do talk about the ethical defence of horse racing, and you're quite strong on that. I think for me that was one of the most encouraging paragraphs in the whole piece. You feel comfortable with an ethical defence of the sport as it stands right now, is that fair?
As it stands at the moment right now, all the things that come out of racing affect horses not only in racing but throughout the rest of society.
Yes.
So the thing cascades down. So the 30 million that the Horse Race Betting Levy Board have spent in the last 20 years on research and vaccines and disease control and biosecurity is slowly filtering down through the other sports and down through ordinary riders and people just using the horses as companions. So horses generally, at every level of it, benefit from what happens in racing.
And that's something we need to stress and get out there.
Absolutely. I think it's the whole horse industry needs racing.